one really interesting thing which pleases me with Fanta is that we have resisted the temptation to go and reinvent things over again, and we've returned to fundamentals.
Right.
And I think that's a really important and sensible decision, because it's always worth noting that the temptation for reinvention in brands is simply too great.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our podcast. This is a podcast that's going to hopefully uncap some trends and directions in the world of marketing today. I'm Ibrahim Khan. I'm from the Coca-Cola Company. Today, I'm joined by Shakir Moin, our president of marketing for North America, recently recognized by Forbes amongst the most entrepreneurial CMOs in North America, an icon of marketing for us at the company. And Rory Sutherland, who obviously needs no introduction, but a visionary in his own right on all things marketing and behavioral science. So, welcome to both of you. Um, the idea of the podcast is really just to give you a little bit of a behind the scenes peek at how some of the best marketeers and best marketing organizations think about brands, branding, iconicity, and all things marketing. And I couldn't have asked for two better guests today to speak to that. And so, with that, let's kick off. As a marketeer, you do feel pressure to leave your mark, to chase fame, right? To bring that newness to the table. Whereas honestly, the reason why the profession exists and historically has existed is actually to drive fortune, not just fame. It's the way I like to think
Of
about
course.
my own marketing, right? Is there's fame and then there's fortune, and you want to balance the two things, right? And so really, Shakir, you work on brand Coke. I think there's very few brands in the world that are as big, iconic, and timeless as brand Coke. And so I'm sure you also at times feel the same pressure of making your mark on that brand. How do you balance that? How do you make a mark on a brand like Coke without breaking it or without going away from the legacy that it already has?
Listen, I have a brutally simple lens that if the work that we're doing behind our brands is not creating growth, I don't want to do that work. And the only mark that we want to leave is two things: building world class people, not world class brands, first world class people, and then those world class people to build world class brands. So the strictest sort of lens with which at least I look at any work, all the work that goes through, is that is it creating growth for the
Right.
brand. Now, especially for brand Coke, but I think it's happening more and more for almost every brand. We were talking just recently about a car company, and I'm gonna avoid the the brand name, but you got to stimulate the brand with
Right.
ideas,
Right.
right? And the ideas have to be what I use a simple term that creativity has to be transactable.
Right.
Creativity is not transactable, it doesn't lead to growth.
Right.
And then, it is, I don't
Creative
know
for
the
the sake
meaning
of
of
creative.
that
Yeah.
creativity.
Got it.
And probably it is not creative because it's not doing anything, it's not spurring human imagination.
Right.
That human imagination changes behavior. The behavior leads to an act from a consumer to drink a beverage, and that act creates growth. It's a very linear and a simple
Yeah. It's
lens to things, but it gets broken down because of the diversion towards let me create something that is not serving that purpose.
right.
So even to your earlier question on the awards, I'm okay for interesting work to be developed, but there's got to be a line of sight on we're doing this, but laddering up to something.
Yeah.
Even after the awards or after that work has been done, because it triggers a change, a
Right.
behavior change, a mindset shift around that particular brand.
Right. No, I love that. And I think it's what Rory said, right? Creativity used to be a metric. It's becoming a little bit of a target.
Yeah,
And when it becomes a target, it becomes the end in and of itself. And that's not kind of the point. You're saying it's the means to the end,
absolutely.
right? Rory, so Shakir talked about Coke. Um, where have you seen great examples of people working on big brands, iconic brands, but they've actually done a good job of building value through creativity, not just necessarily with creativity as the objective in and of itself.
I mean, one great advantage of being an iconic brand is that you can be very creative because the well established nature of your visual identity and all those other properties enables you to say more with less. And so, a campaign I particularly admired, and actually Mark Ritson also wrote about this in some detail, was the McDonald's campaign where they used the logo, the M, about as recognizable as it gets
Hmm.
outside the field of Coke, and they used it to give directions to McDonald's. In other words, they took a selective part of the M and they basically then used it as an arrow on an outdoor campaign. Now, that was a fantastic thing in that it was completely unexpected, it was completely original, but it was entirely um, uh, consistent with I mean, nothing could be more consistent
Right.
with their brand identity. And I thought that was a magnificent example of taking something, because there is always this challenge, which is to some extent the consumer notices the unexpected.
Right.
And so, you do walk a fine line between being entirely predictable and therefore not really garnering much attention, and then what David Ogilvy would call sort of skating on the ice of irrelevance, in an attempt merely to get attention. But if you can manage to do that, of course, Share a Coke was an absolute case of using iconic elements of a centuries old brand and and conveying something in a completely fresh way.
Yeah, I love that. And so there are times where you do need to evolve. Do need to, or you talked about skating on the ice of irrelevance, right? That's so interesting because there are times where there is a case for change, right? Your audience changes, your market changes, or a previous positioning on your brand isn't relevant anymore. Shakir, what do you think? How should we think about moments like that where you're working on a brand? When is it a good time to change? When is it a mistake to change? Most of the brands we work on are fairly established brands.
There's an analogy that I always use with my team. It's called listening to hoofbeats.
Hmm.
So apparently, and I don't know how true it is or not, but it's it's a fascinating concept that the Russians used to put their ear onto the ground to listen to the hoofbeats of the forces that were about to attack them.
Okay.
So that's the concept of listening to the hoofbeats. I think what we try to do at Coke is listen to hoofbeats all the time,
Okay.
and because if we have come to the point where the brand has not skated to irrelevance but has broken to the thin ice and is sinking, it happens.
Yeah.
It's reality, but shame on us for that to
Right.
happen.
Okay.
Because the brands don't become irrelevant suddenly. They take it. It's a
Takes
process. It
time.
takes time. But sometimes people just sleep
Right.
while skating, which is a fantastic analogy that you can keep on using. Um, so listening to finding those signals where brand is starting to lose its momentum, its
Okay.
shine, its engagement is when you got to act. The next question is, what's the issue we're trying to solve? My favorite
Okay.
question always is, what's the problem we're trying to solve?
Right.
And often, almost, I never end up getting the right answer.
Right.
But getting the answer to that question is the single most important things.
Right.
A lot of time, what I've seen is that irrelevance is not happening with consumer; it's happening because of factors outside consumers.
Hmm.
Something has happened with the retail space. Something happened with the competitive space. Something has happened with the economy. Got to figure out what's that thing to solve and that one thing to solve. And in those moments where the consumer becomes an issue, we have become less relevant, less exciting, it's losing its magic, is when you start getting into to see again what's the problem we're trying to solve.
Right.
And the challenge again on that is the natural tendency is to throw the baby, the bathwater, the tub, and the room,
Right.
everything out
Right.
versus looking at is there better ways to imagine or reimagine the stories that we used to tell within the same idea.
Right.
If the idea is dead, you got to figure out a new idea.
Makes sense.
But again, great brands and iconic brands are iconic because of certain timelessness that they carry with them.
Right.
Apart Nike is a really great brand that does it.
Right.
Apple does it as well. And then it's the relevance, and in our case, 137 years, the fundamental promise of Coke still remains the same. It's how we tell those stories in an exciting, relevant, interesting ways is what keeps us relevant after.
Yeah, like we were Rory last week going through the archives at Coke, and it's mind blowing how some of the things we were saying and doing more than 100 years ago are still things that we are saying and doing today because it's still part of the legacy of the brand and why people drink and love
I
the
have a
brand.
very interesting example out of my career, which was I was fortunate enough to go through this. In 2012, we were entering the Myanmar opened up, and we were entering Myanmar, and very high profile entry. Obviously, there are only few countries left in the world where Coke doesn't do
Right.
business, right? So, and it's a rare opportunity as a marketer to enter a new market with Coca Cola. And as you can imagine, everyone had a point of view on what we want to say about the
Yeah.
brand, right? I remember that time our global campaign was called Open Happiness, and there was advice that came to us from, well, Myanmar opening up, and it's about
It's
happiness. So
about
open
happiness.
happiness, you can't go wrong with that.
Right.
Um, but one of the things that we did was we went back into the Coke archives and understood that we did enter multiple markets across history. There are times when we were not in a market, and for example, South Africa,
Hmm.
when the Berlin Wall fell, how did we enter East Germany? When we re-entered India, what happened at that time, and so on and so forth. And in that journey, one of the questions came in was, well, we did enter US in 1886, and what happened then? And the answer, interestingly, across all but the first answer, which was in 1886, still worked in 2012 in Myanmar, which was the promise of delicious and refreshing.
Right.
And that was our launch idea, the launch message with which we
Right.
we, we entered
Yeah,
Myanmar.
that's what you see from work 100 years
Yeah.
ago when Coke entered the US, right? Rory, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the magic of Coke is precisely, and it goes back to someone like Asa Candler, in the 19th century, who discovered the product, I think bought the rights for it for about $2,300 or something. But his whole idea was, I think this is so great, everybody would like it.
Right.
And so you've had that wonderful kind of optimism and confidence. Now, if I'd been, to be honest, if I'd been a sort of slightly cynical British marketing advisor in Britain in 1945 or 1930, and someone had suggested, I think Coke would be popular in the UK. And I would have given lots of reasons. We drink much more alcohol than Americans do. Our climate's terrible. It's not very hot. You can't get ice. We drink a lot of tea, etc. Okay. And yet, nobody got actually wrong footed by any of these factors. They just went into the UK, and admittedly, we don't drink at the same volume that Americans do, but it was pretty much as popular and as welcome there as it was back in the 19th century in the US. And so I think that the fact that you always approach the world with an opportunity mindset, not a constraints mindset, and that kind of dates back to Asa Candler, is really a really precious thing. In other words, it is a highly confident brand that doesn't listen to naysayers too much. And I think, if you lose that, that's the problem.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And Rory, it reminds me of the question you were asking me earlier about what we're doing on Fanta, and which is again another big global iconic brand, and one which we are changing, but we're changing it in a very interesting way. So, yeah, I don't know if you want to share that question with the audience and with Shakir here.
No, so it's a very interesting brand in the sense that I was astounded by the size of the brand, in that, as you said, it's larger than Gillette. It's an absolutely enormous kind of multi-billion-dollar brand. And it probably, it's fair to say, is kind of less famous than it deserves to be, given its economic importance. But one really interesting thing which pleases me with Fanta is that we have resisted the temptation to go and reinvent things over again, and we've returned to fundamentals.
Right.
And I think that's a really important and sensible decision, because it's always worth noting that the temptation for reinvention in brands is simply too great. That's not to say there are times when you shouldn't do it, but Well, for one thing, actually, funnily enough, it's always worth noting that the people who work in marketing and advertising are not representative of the general population. If you look at them on
Very
psychological
true.
dimensions, they're much keener on openness to experience. They're much
Right.
less conservative with a small c. They're much more excited by change than the average member of the population is. And so there is probably, just by temperament and also sometimes by career incentives, there's this urge to change things. And what we've done is something I think absolutely right, which is we've gone back to a time-tested property which has already proved itself. And I think it's absolutely the right thing to do. I think Mark Ritson will be proud of us. That I think we call it brand equity for a reason, which is like other forms of investment, it compounds over time.
Right. Right.
You know, fame is something which doesn't grow linearly; it actually compounds over time, a bit like a pension.
Right.
And so, that's one very good reason why we should always instinctively want to reinvest in existing properties rather than starting afresh.
Right. I don't think I've ever thought of fame as a pension, but that's an interesting thought. And I think just to share some context and then check your question to you is um, we've obviously tried to rediscover the magic for a brand like Fanta. It's a big brand, Rory, as you said, economically much bigger
Mm,
than a lot of brands that we consider iconic and timeless. But in the recent past, we've been trying to find a home for this brand. Succeeded in some pockets, but not really on a global scale, the way, for example, we do with Coke or with Sprite or with many of our other brands. And so, what we've done, Shakir, as you know, and launching today, in fact, in the US, is the comeback of one of our most timeless platforms, Wanta Fanta, as you can see on my sweatshirt. If I don't know if you can see it or not, but it's there with the lyrics of the song. And we're bringing back something from almost 2 decades ago in a way that is hopefully relevant to consumers, to teens in particular, and helps us build that connection, Rory, to fundamentals of this brand. Shakir, you've been here with us on this journey. Um, what do you think about it? Do you think it's going to work? What do you think were the principles there? What was going through your mind as we were developing this work?
Well, first, I hope or rather it better work. There's a definition of brand that I use, and uh, it's attributed to Churchill. Churchill sort of used similar words for Russia. My definition is a brand is a promise wrapped in an experience inside a memory.
Wow.
And the
Okay.
top and tail. So, brand is a promise
Okay.
wrapped in experience inside a memory. The Russian quote is far more interesting and Churchill's brilliance. And if the top and tail of this is promise and memory,
Right.
uh, to the discussion on, remember when you were earlier asking about when do you change or when you evolve on the brand, uh, the journey that we went through together with you was to understand what was the problem we're trying to solve. And the problem we were trying to solve was that we had fundamentally steered away from the core promise of what Fanta was.
Right.
The genesis of Fanta is fascinating. And in 1950s, right after Second World War, in a German business, apparently there was a shortage of the beverage base that we provide to our bottlers to make Coca-Cola. They wanted to make more products on the lines, and they started a project called Project Fantasy, and ended up creating Fanta out of that. And the core promise was deliciousness.
Right.
It was taste. And as we looked at the work that we did in the US, we realized that we left that space,
Right.
and for reasons nobody knows. No point going back in the past on why it happened, but at least we knew what's the problem we were trying to solve, which
Right.
is going back to the core of that. And then the second bit was, well, and I love Rory's point of view on this as well, because I'm in a similar camp. There's a temptation first to go and create
New.
something new. And I forget which artist said this, that anything that should be created has been created already. All we're trying to do is discover creations of the past in different ways. If you fundamentally remember this, I think it makes us very humble when we get into the bandwagon of let's create something new. And there's
Yeah.
excitement obviously on creating something new to do so. Uh, there was a campaign in early 2000 called the Fantanas, which still carries a lot of memory. remember, memory
Yeah.
of the brand. And we maybe got tired and bored of this way before the consumers did.
Right.
And there was no data, nothing that showed us that there was a problem with that idea.
Right.
And I think what the brand teams have done a wonderful job with our agency partners is to connect the promise with that Fantanas, or which is now called the Wanta idea, in a way which truly makes the proposition of Fanta as lip smacking delicious as the core proposition.
Right.
So, and that's what we are launching actually today in the
Fingers crossed.
US. Fingers crossed, with a lot of excitement. Um, whether it's going to work or not, yes, and obviously the jury is the
The
consumers, whether they're
consumer.
going to love it or not. My my immediate test is always our bottling partners,
Right.
our frontline salespeople, because they are much closer actually to the market than even we are.
Very
Because they
true.
see things day in and day out from a consumer lens, obviously, but from a customer lens. And they're super excited about this campaign going out. So it gives me
Excellent.
a lot of conviction and belief that I think we have something great in our
That's
hands.
super. And as Rory said, the psychology of marketeers is always more experimental. Maybe not so much for salespeople who have to go
Yeah,
and face the customer
absolutely.
every day, and
Correct.
consumers who just thrive in familiarity. Rory, you've seen the work. We've tried to bring back, as Shakir said, elements of memory on the brand so that we can say more with less. Would love your opinion on what you've seen.
I love the fact that the promise is naked self interest. In other words, sometimes there are just things you want. And I'm not a complete opponent of purpose-driven advertising or purpose-driven brands, but it did occur to me that if more than a certain proportion of brands start adopting higher purpose, it makes things for the consumer seem like incredibly hard work. Okay. Every time you go shopping, you have to think about sort of second order and third order considerations. And Jeremy
Right.
Bullmore, the late Jeremy Bullmore, always made the point that everybody in life, in order to remain sane, actually, has a certain amount of income which is discretionary, which is to treat themselves. And in fact, life is very difficult to endure if you don't have a certain amount of income which is just for you. And so, one of the things I like about it is that it is unapologetically a promise of self indulgence, which I think is absolutely right. And I also think, it's something that, for whatever reason, and we never quite know, but the original campaign always resonated with me very strongly. It will, and seeing it refreshed is really healthy. But also, it is that brilliant thing of actually sticking to your knitting with a great brand is a great thing. It always mystified me for a short time, and I never quite worked out why. KFC actually lost finger licking good and kind of started semi-retiring Colonel Sanders, who, by
Right.
some argument, is the most recognizable face on the planet. And so the importance of actually essentially maintaining a brand by building on existing equity and then refreshing it. The other point I'd make is, of course, you're planning to innovate the product significantly. Now, I'm not going to give
Right.
away any trade secrets here because that's not my
Not yet,
job;
Rory,
that's
please.
yours. But if you're planning to innovate in terms of what products are actually covered by that brand, it makes
Right.
doubly good sense not to change the brand as well. And I've got a kind of
Right.
analogy which I use there, which was a brilliant bit of advice given to Ford by a fantastic business writer called Roger L. Martin, where Ford wanted to introduce a new electric car division and create completely new brands on a new electric platform. And Roger Martin went to them and said, that makes sense from a boardroom perspective. It's very, very neat. But from a consumer perspective, you have 5 real assets. You have the F-150, the Bronco, the Explorer, the Transit, and the Mustang. Go and make
Right.
electric versions of those. In other words, don't ask people to buy a completely new car under a completely new brand. At least give them the benefit of maintaining one familiar aspect. And of course, what's interesting about that is the F-150. I don't think many people bought the electric F-150 for environmental reasons, but it meant that there was a whole market for an electric car through the familiarity of the F-150 brand. That the appeal for them was that you could power your house off the truck in many ways. But I think that was a brilliant bit of advice. Don't, in other words, ask people to buy a completely new product under a completely new brand. It's asking too much. And so if you're planning to innovate the product to a great extent, do the opposite with the brand, maintain the brand and strengthen it.
The golden words, Rory. I'm gonna write that somewhere right after this session. I was just saying, like, you both obviously been part of this journey on Wanta Fanta. And Shakir, to your point, understanding the problem on the brand and understanding that we had kind of lost our anchor in what the product was all about, which is deliciousness, was a big unlock in building this work. And then I think, I can, to the where we open this chat, around the pressure to do something new, create something new. I can tell you, like, bringing back something from the past, not everyone was very excited about it. I was giving an interview last week, where the journalist was like, "So if you run out of new ideas, why are you bringing back this whole thing?" And to the contrary, I felt like it was actually much harder to bring back something old because it made sense, Rory. And like you're saying, make it easy for the consumer. If we change everything, then it becomes unrecognizable. And I think, one of my reflections on this, Shakir, obviously you lead a big team, and Rory, you work with marketeers across the world. But when it came to one of Fanta was protecting, the stuff that we were bringing back, there's always a lot of pressure on the team. I think we did a good job of understanding what would still be relevant and what would not. But just that irrational pressure of, coming up with new things, was there. And how do you think we go about managing that as people working on these brands day in and day out?
I guess the critique or the worry would be real, right? That are, for example, are we being lazy about it?
Right.
Right? As in we
That was the implication of the journalist, like you're being lazy,
right,
right?
we're being
So, yeah.
lazy, or we can't figure out anything, so let's pull out something from the closet from the past and
Right.
put it up. I think what a lot of people don't realize is the amount of obsession we have on diligence and detail about this.
Right.
And the number of sessions we have had
Yes.
on what is the problem, why, how do we, what is the core idea, why that core idea, how do we romance this, are there ways to do this? And the first answer wasn't to go back into
It
history to
wasn't.
look
Yes.
at it. It was part
No.
of understanding the brand, and something started to pop up
Right.
versus, well, here was a great campaign we ran in the past, let's bring it
Right.
again because it was wonderful 20 years back, it's going to be wonderful today.
Right.
And that wasn't, if that was the thing, I would have been the first one to stand in front of it and say, well,
And
no,
no.
we're not going to
Right.
do that.
Okay.
But this became a solution to the problem, uh, versus a solution for which we created a problem which wasn't true. And I think that's difficult
Right.
for a lot of people to understand, obviously, because they've not been
Right.
in the kitchen as
Right.
we have been. What I can tell you is when I speak to our stakeholders, which is usually our bottling partners, we take them through this journey. And some of our bottlers have been bottlers for multiple decades.
They've seen it all.
They've seen it all. They've
They've
seen
seen many
fantastic.
me.
Exactly.
many-
They've seen many me's and they've
right.
seen multiple. In fact, some who have probably seen all the Fanta campaigns and not only
Right.
the last, over the last 2 decades. And when they give you the belief that, what, I'm excited that you guys are going back to the core. I'm excited that you are repromising something that where we started from, and not again creating something new for the sake of something new. It gives me confidence that we have something. Again, we'll see how consumers respond to
Yeah.
it. But I think in terms of what I can assure, I think all the viewers and everyone who would be listening to it, there wasn't an out of laziness. I don't think in the last like 5 6 months we have worked as intensely on a brand as
Yeah.
we have done on Fanta because it was a very difficult problem
To
to solve.
solve.
In now hindsight 2020, it looks very easy
Right.
because wow, well, you should have done that and you should have brought this idea back in. But at, it wasn't how it started.
no.
It was not
No.
in the middle. It started to form towards the tail end.
Right.
We tested, we pushed, and eventually, when it went through fire, we did
Right.
see that we had something strong in our
Right.
hand.
And I think there's still stuff to figure out. But Shakir, to
Absolutely.
your point, like, the simplicity to which we have arrived now belies the complexity that
Yeah,
we had to go
yeah,
through to arrive
absolutely.
at it, right? In hindsight, it feels it was obvious, but 6 months ago, it felt
Yeah.
anything but. And Rory, I've been consulting you on this work as well, and you've been there on the journey too. So, any thoughts or questions, Rory, from
Yeah,
your end
I
on
think there's a
the
kind of yeah, I think there's a kind of Warren Buffett approach to brand management, which is you continually question yourself, but you don't act gratuitously. In other words, by default, you stick to what you're doing and you stick to what you believe, while continually actually, imposing a reasonable amount of self-doubt and questioning. And there's a lovely statistic about the overpropensity of people to change, which is that um, there was an online investment portal in the UK which looked at some of their most successful investors, and they discovered it was people who'd lost their password. And as a result, because they'd lost their password, they were unable to continually interfere with their portfolio and rejig their portfolio. So actually, these people
That's so
proved the
funny.
most successful investors because they actually stuck at it. And I think this is a really important point, because one of the things is we sort of justify our jobs quarterly and annually, and yet
Yes.
brands are really built over 5 to 10 year periods. And just as in the
Right,
investment community, there's probably a disproportionate bias towards looking busy. I think the same
right,
probably applies in brand management as well. That
right,
there is that danger of, does this just look lazy? But
right.
actually, brands are built over timescales which are very, very different from the arbitrary
They
timescales of
exceed
kind
the
of
tenure of a
financial
brand
and other
manager, Rory.
judgment.
Yeah. No, 100%. And
Yeah,
so I just got a
absolutely that.
new investment strategy from that answer. Lose my password. I love that, Rory. I'm gonna delete it from my phone very quickly.
I don't know if you guys are House fans. You know the TV program House,
Yeah,
Doctor
yeah,
House.
I've
There was
seen.
one episode called Occam's Razor. So
Uh-huh.
when I saw the titles, I didn't know what Occam's Razor was. So something to do with razor. I used to work for Gillette, so I was excited. Maybe there's something to do with razors. And the Occam's Razor is this thing that the simplest explanation is almost always the right one. And Rory, exactly to what you're saying, as in I think we try to look for problems that don't exist when the simplest truisms are right in front of us, and we just
Right.
got to go back to them again and again and again. In my 30 years with Coke, there have been moments where we have struggled with the brand in a certain country, and almost always it was we moved away from the core promise of Coke. It was we
Right.
got bored with it.
Right.
Let us figure out something else. Here's a new generation coming up, and they're gonna drink beverages in a very different way. Reality is, we are still as NASA said, an imperfect machine,
Yeah.
pretty much acting in the same way as 100 years back.
Yeah, I love that. And so
Funnily enough, as a little bit of local detail, Ockham, where William of Ockham lived, is just down the road from me in
oh,
Surrey.
really?
And I
Oh
did
way!
actually go there. So I actually went and visited Ockham in the hope that there'd be a barber with a really good pun in their name. I thought someone had to come up with a hairdresser in Ockham but nobody has. They're completely unimaginative, the people of Ockham. There's also a phrase in medicine which I like. You mentioned house earlier, which is, when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. And it's the same thing.
I
Look for
love
the
that.
most obvious explanation first before you go somewhere else. Yeah.
Yep.
Obviously, in
Super
Africa,
nice.
possibly a different rule would apply, but you take my
Yes.
point. Yeah.
You probably do look for zebras over there. No, but guys, this has been fascinating. I think, we started out by talking about, the impulse or the pressure. Both forces apply, to any marketeer working on any brand, to find fame, to make their mark, to do something new. We've all been through it,
Yeah.
it's always a temptation and you have to fight it. We talked about, for example, how on brand Coke, a brand with so much legacy and history and iconicity, well, how do you go about doing that? Rory, we talked about the fact that, fame has its place and it has a purpose. But as marketeers, we also need to make sure we're focusing on the hardworking, fortune building work for which we actually get paid, to be honest, right? Wanta Fanta, as we said, is interesting, in that it is a change, but it is a change to bring back a part of the brand's legacy for consumers today. Rory, I love what you said about making it easier for consumers. Shakir, obviously, great insights and behind the scenes from yourself and how you think. But guys, any last thoughts or anything from your end, Shakir, Rory?
Just that we forget that there are two parts in some ways to marketing. And one of them, which always interests me, is that if you look at brain scans of people buying familiar brands, they actually register less brain activity, not more. And that's because the very familiarity makes something a system one behavior. It's something you don't have to think about very much, rather than a system two behavior. If people are buying something completely unfamiliar and new, their brains light up in all kinds of ways.
Right.
And understanding that value of reassuring familiarity is probably something we need to actually have a much better handle on. And I think it's just really, really important. I'll tell you a very funny story, by the way, which is, as a lifetime Diet Coke drinker, there was a brief period where Coke changed the cap of Diet Coke bottles from white or silver to red, the same color as classic Coke. Now, for weird reasons, I'd love to know the neuroscience behind this. During that period, before you changed it back, I couldn't really enjoy drinking Diet Coke. And it's very strange the extent to which, in some ways, the packaging and in other words, it is actually true to say that the advertising affects the product in that way, that actually what we see affects what we expect, and what we expect affects what we experience. I find that, I find that very, very interesting, which is another reason to be really cautious about too much change.
Right. No, that's lovely, Rory. And so to your point, familiarity obviously helps make things easier for consumers. I think, as a marketeer, that's one lesson I'm taking away, which is make it easy for consumers. The more complicated and difficult you make it, Shakir, to your point around brand experience and memory, right? It's about kind of affecting those memory structures where it becomes easy for a consumer to choose your brand. Shakir, any last thoughts?
And it's something very topical. I was in Chicago yesterday meeting our Fairlife, which is our milk business team, and one of the questions that had come in was around marketing a science and an art. It's a proverbial question that comes out again and again. And
And
I've
so what's
got
the answer, Shakir?
I don't think I have an answer. But all I can say is that I've gone through a journey of, well, it's an art.
Uh-huh.
Then I got disgusted with that, and I moved into science, and I got bored with this, and I thought it was art and science. Today, after 30 years, where I am is, and I passionately believe in this because I love our profession, is that I think it's a craft.
That's
And
interesting.
what if you look at, and I had this beautiful experience of spending some time in Japan as part of our coffee business. Everything in Japan has craftsmanship, and the craftsmanship is not random
Yes.
art. It has science built into it. The If you see how sushi is made, for every sushi that is made, there's the sort of fish that is being picked up, the knives that are being used are sharpened in a certain way to cut sushi in a certain way, and you nobody knows that,
Right.
but there is so much preparation that goes in, and there's the art on how it's wrapped and how it's tasted. All of those elements coming together. And like any craft, it needs to be practiced, it needs to be honed, it needs to be questioned. You look out and you see who else is doing this better, where else can I get inspiration from? So for quite some time I've been brewing with this idea that this is a craft, and we got to be proud about it, we got to be passionate about it, we got to invite the best people who should join this craft and raise the game for
That's so good, Shakir, because I always wonder the art and science question has been there since we were this small in the world of marketing. Are
Yeah.
we generalists or are we specialists? Do we get outdated over time because we become irrelevant or out of touch, or do we get better at what we do? So many interesting nuances. So I love kind of the single mindedness of calling it a craft because I think it speaks to both the art and the science without belaboring the point. So,
I think that's true. I mean, the way I've always cheated the way I've always cheated the answer to that question is by saying it's a science, but if you look at science with any detail, you realize that science is also an art. in
Yep.
that the
Right.
most interesting scientific breakthroughs are often made by actually answering a question that hasn't been asked yet. In some ways, whether it's penicillin or vaccination, actually, the process actually, it's emphatically not even science is that linear process that we pretend it is. Where
It's anything
where
but
your
linear,
starting point
Rory.
is clear.
Yes.
It's anything but linear. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
exactly. No, I love that, guys. And as with anything good in this world, it's about balance, fame and fortune, art and science. Craft is a
Yes,
lovely new word. Well,
I agree.
gentlemen, thank you
Thank you.
so much for some riveting insights, for some great stock advice. Rory, I am going to keep that in mind as I go ahead.
Forget your password, burn it. Yes, absolutely.
And for some really good insights in terms of how things actually happen behind the scenes. These are questions that any marketeer like myself are faced with every day. This is really the bulk of what we do. And so it's great to hear from people like yourselves in terms of your journeys and your thoughts. So thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you,
Um,
Rory.
and hopefully we all want a Fanta very soon.
Wanta Fanta.